Time for Maintenance Matters with T.A. Petro. And our good friend Homer Hogg is in the studio up in Nashville with Rooster this morning. And, of course, Homer is the manager of technical development at T.A. Petro. Oriean Clayton from Davco is with us. And first off, good morning to you, Homer.
Good morning, Dave. Nemo, here we are again, buddy.
Indeed, and we're really interested and looking forward to your discussion with Oriean, but I thought maybe you would do the formal introduction for us.
Well, you know what? This is a pretty interesting business that we work in around trucks and the trucking industry, and you meet a lot of people down through the years, and you know what? It's kind of an interesting business, Dave. You think about it, you just can't get rid of us, right? We come into this business and it gets into your blood, and you just can't get it out. And Mr. Clayton's with us this morning, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm honored. You just can't be around him but a few minutes and like the guy. You just can't help it. And he's very well seasoned in this business, working with our friends over there at Davco, and I'm honored to have him on the show. And he'd do a much better job than I ever could introducing himself, so I'm gonna let him do that. But I tell you what, we were talking about it. I don't know, Mr. Clayton. I think we may have. I don't even know when we started this conversation about getting on the air. Maybe at TMC. I don't even remember. But we cross paths from time to time, like most of us do in this industry. And he's well known in this business and well respected in his business. And obviously their products speak for themselves. And so, me on the air, we talk about fuel a lot because there's a lot of money in fuel. And your engine needs one thing, and it needs it well, and that's fuel. It needs the right fuel at the right time in the right condition. And so I think what the folks at Davco do, they do a really good job managing that. And so we're going to get in the weeds on that this morning. But, Mr. Clayton, I'm glad to have you, and I'm glad you're here. Why don't you just tell the folks who you are and what you do over there at Davco?
Well, the honor is actually mine. Thanks for having us home. We really appreciate it. Davco technology has been around since 1976, and most of the industry does know us now. All the guys that report to Davco, the regional guys out in the field, they're all old technicians like myself. I go back quite a few years. I mean, a lot of years. I worked in truck garage in high school, worked on helicopters, worked as a Cummins engine tech, worked at Ruan, Jelco Truck Leasing. I've been at Davco 26 years and still having fun. What does Davco do? Davco has a fuel heater water separator filter all in one, known as the Fuel Pro. Right now it's kind of an industry standard. Most everyone knows it. A lot of things we can talk about. Homer and I have been chatting about this morning. There's a lot of good things. Also at Davco, we're in Saline, Michigan. It's outside of Ann Arbor. We have around 65 employees, and most of them have been there for many, many years. We have a lot of employees that have been there for a long time, and including our field staff. So we have a good company, a good product. And again, our folks that are out there in the field, they're not sales personnel. They're old techs like me, and that's a big part of our success. We visit the fleets and we do trade shows, and we're really glad to be on this show with you, Homer.
I tell you, I'm honored to have you here, and I can't wait to get into conversation because those that know me know I just get into technical stuff and jump into deep weeds and talk about the stuff that certainly I think are relevant. But when I think about Davco, I'm not even sure that most of us know there are other products out there. So you guys have done a great job really getting in the market and have a great product. And, we don't even talk about fuel water separators. Everybody says Davco. How's your Davco doing it? Because it is the name in the business and does a great job. But let's just kind of get talking about it a little bit this morning. And, when I've done shows on fuel and the quality of fuel and the need for that from the engine perspective. Let's talk a little bit about your product and really your Davco Fuel Pros, what they do and why that big old thing is strapped to the side of a frame of a truck anyway.
Well, that's a subject we really like talking about. Everyone knows us as seeing is believing, and that's our clear cover, and that's the clear cover up on top. Sometimes it gets confused. They say there's a cover on the bottom. Ours is the one with the clear cover on top where you can literally see the fuel filter and how much filter life's available. We're going to talk a little bit also about extending filter life and why that is. But we're a fuel heater, water separator, filter, all contained into one unit. In essence, what we do is we protect the injection system, period. That's why we're involved, and that's why we're there. When it comes to fuel heating itself, we have electric preheaters for 12-volt, 120-volt to plug into the block heater. We have coolant heat, which we'll talk. That's another subject you and I were discussing. not return fuel heat anymore. We're going to use engine coolant heat because of all the cold weathers we've had. We found that's a solution. When it comes to filtration, we have the Elemax. Elemax design in itself is designed that you're going to see the fuel level rise in our clear cover, but the Elemax has a half wrap above it. Everyone sees that when they look in the clear cover. And that fuel level rises to the top, and as it rises, it gives you an indication of what filter life you have left. But with the Elemax design, there's actually a vapor pressure relief valve up on top of that filter. It's calibrated. That's why it's important to use the correct filter in our unit. So when that fuel level rises, as it becomes contaminated, it's the path of least resistance. So as it rises and it gets to this half wrap, and Homer, I talked, we got to visualize this now. So we're on a fuel tank, and then you got the engine itself, and the Davco Fuel Pro is mounted in between. So we're on the vacuum side of the fuel system. We're literally pulling fuel through like a straw. We're sucking it through. So as that fuel goes through the filter media, it goes up to the filter media. It's going to contaminate and start restricting, but it doesn't restrict. The path of least resistance is a clean media because it works its way up. Now, when it gets to this half wrap of this filter, which everyone visualizes on our clear cover, when you look into it, there's a half wrap. It's solid at the top, and it's a purpose. So when a fuel level gets to that point, it is literally vapor pressure that's there from the sloshing of the fuel, the vapor itself, and it just goes through the filter media. When you get this half wrap, that fuel can't go through. That vapor pressure cannot go through that. So as this vapor pressure builds, it holds the fuel level to that half wrap. But up underneath, in the filter media itself, it's slowly and doing its job. It's filtering the fuel. And it goes to we're going to talk about the Stratopore. There's 3 layers. It's going to filter to the micron it's rating at. So up underneath, the fuel itself is contaminating and taking care of removing the contaminants, gets to the top, and then you start getting a restriction. Now, when the restriction inside that filter media, all the media gets to the 6 inches of mercury, and then it opens that vapor pressure relief valve, which is calibrated at the top. Again, that's important why you use the same filter you had from the factory. When that calibration opens at 6 inches of mercury, that vapor pressure that was holding the fuel down at the bottom of that half wrap, now it's going to rise. It's going to open that vapor pressure relief valve. Is momentarily going to open. That vapor pressure is gone, so the fuel level now rises up that half wrap, maybe a half inch, 3/4 inch, depending on the flow rate and a lot of other things. So it's going to continue doing this, opening and closing and building vapor pressure. And when that fuel level gets all the way to the top of this filter now you're at a full 6 inches of mercury. And this is a great position to be. It's time to change your filter. However, that 6 inches of mercury is like a low spec. Most specs are like 6 inches to 12 inches. You're not going to affect the engine performance generally to about 12 inches of mercury. So you have a cushion there, a margin there. So think about this. If you're going down a highway and you had replaced your fuel or you filled up, and the next time you look at your fuel pro and all of a sudden it jumped way up, you realize you had a bad load of fuel. Or in retrospect, if it's time for service and that fuel level is nowhere near the top, that's all clean media. You don't have to change that filter because it's all seeing is believing. You know when to change that filter to the top. So the media itself that we use is called Stratopore. These 3 layers of media. It's not cellulose either. This is a laminated melt-blown media, which we can talk a little bit more about. But it's designed that, let's take most engines today, they're around 10 micron. Well, there's 3 layers of media on this, and it's a micron rating higher for each one, and it gets down to that 10 micron. So what that means is, as that contaminant comes in, we're not putting all the contamination against this 10 micron media. It's a couple other media sizes above it, so we can contaminate, or we can take contamination and compress more into the same area, which is going to extend filter life because your filter level is still going to stay lower. So as this is moving up with the Stratopore, and in 2004, they had a emulsified water spec that was in fuel systems with the emissions 2004. Previous to that, there was only emulsified spec on the pressure side. Now, in 2004 emissions, it had to be in the vacuum side. So this is where the Stratopore really came in, along with our Elemax, because we exceeded that emulsified water spec. Now, most filters today is going to be cellulose, and it's going to be treated with something to ensure you meet that emulsified water spec. The problem with that is if you're just treating it as the fuel's flowing through it, it's an erosion factor. So it's going to erode away, and you're not going to be as efficient when you get to the end of the filter life. Now, when it comes to the Stratopore and the design we have with our Elemax, it's not going to erode because it's just part of the laminated melt-blown media. So you're going to have a higher percentage of emulsified water spec at the end of the filter life on this. So that's the filter side. And then water separation, another factor is free water as it comes into our unit from the tank. And again, we're under a vacuum, so we're pulling the fuel through. When it comes into the Fuel Pro, the fuel is going to drop to the bottom. Fuel is much heavier than fuel. I loved it. I've been with the company 26 years, and we used to do this little test. We'd go into shops, do a lot of training, and we'd take an ice cube and some diesel fuel and say, okay, for a Coke, you guys think this is going to float on the top of the fuel, or is it going to drop to the bottom because it's water? Well, it's still the same specific gravity, so the ice cube will drop to the bottom.
Right to the bottom.
So the bottom line is any free water that comes in from the fuel tank into the Fuel Pro is going to drop directly to the bottom.
Right.
And, of course, we have a drain valve to drain it away. So we literally have taken free water, made a great primary filter at the bottom. Large contaminants that way, too. As they come in, they're going to drop to the bottom to be drained away. So we're going to separate the water. We're going to heat the fuel in 3 different ways, 12-volt preheater, 120-volt preheater, it can be tied to your block heater, and then you're going to filter the fuel itself, and we can extend the filter life. We may be talking a bit here about our newer product, which is the 483, which is much larger. We have the 42 for specific engines, Detroit, and 43s for the other engines, and the guys are averaging over 100,000 miles in the filter life on this media.
Phenomenal.
Yeah, that's what we're all about, is we're processing the fuel is what we're doing.
So what are the things that you're trying to prevent from reaching the engine, right? And why? You know, we have this great big old monster thing on the side of the frame, right? And it's pretty important. There's no doubt about it. And the fact that you guys have a bowl on top where you can visually see when it's time to replace the filter is certainly a benefit. And, you know, I appreciate the technology, because I'm a tech guy. So I appreciate the fact that filter has the ability to really use the entire life of the element itself. And that's pretty unique in itself. And I appreciate that. But, you know, if I'm worried about my engine, why am I concerned about having this type of filter in? And what could get by my filter, and what kind of damage could that cause to the engine?
Well, there's a couple ways to answer that. First thing is, back in the 70s, there used to be 3 items. You'd have a fuel water separator, you'd have a heater, and you'd have a filter. And that's where we combine them all together. Now, as I said before, the only reason we're even there to have a product is to protect the injection system. Excuse me. So if you have any kind of contaminants in today's fuel, which we may be talking about, it may be ultra-low sulfur. It's supposed to be the best, but you have biodiesel. It holds more water. And when you hear the word water, and most guys know, if you get water in an injection system, it's going to cost you money, is what the bottom line is. Because you get in there, you're going to start scoring. You're going to have injector tips, and you have all kinds of issues. The contaminants themselves. You know, it's interesting. When ultra-low sulfur first came out, we did some testing with one of the engine manufacturers, and with our standard smaller filter, we get over 100,000 miles in it, but it was controlled fuel. If you have good fuel, a filter is going to last a long time. You get it in a commercial, and it literally gets out in the real world. You go through the pipes, you go through the environment, you're pumping it down into the tanks, into the fueling stations, and there's a lot of contaminants get involved. And when you get that contaminant, and that's why, especially with the emission engines today, from the 2004, 7, and 10s even more, it's tight tolerances, extremely tight tolerances. If you get any kind of contaminant in there, it will score, it will lock, it's going to cost you money. When it comes to the water separation and the contaminants itself, and in the cold weather. In the cold weather, it's not so much it's going to affect the engine, but is the engine even going to start? Because you can't get the fuel through that filter because it comes so clouded almost to the pour point. And we talk about pour point, cloud point. Bottom line is it's the paraffins themselves. And you get the paraffins in a cold weather, they start loading up the filter, it starves the engine for fuel, and you start going down, hence our heaters. So we're taking care of the heating. The contaminants are huge. The tolerances are just extremely tight in the emission engines, and it's a good thing. It's our engines, you know, there's a lot of complaints in the industry, obviously, about the cost and all the emission issues, but they're very clean engines. Everyone hates to see the black smoke out of diesel. It gives us a bad reputation. So we're there to protect the injection system.
Very good. You know, because, you know, I know these injectors are very tight, and they have to be able to perform at the level that's required. You know, you look back in 2004 when we took exhaust and put it right back into the engine, and, you know, with EGR, and that was a challenge. Then we messed around 2007, and now we've got all kinds of heat issues, and we've got all kinds of things going on in the exhaust system. And then 2010, we add additional elements to our after treatment, and we're working that engine pretty hard. And obviously the fuel is the heart and soul of it. I mean, without fuel, we don't go. And so we have to have fuel. Let's back up to the tank, and let's just kind of start at the tank and work our way to the fuel water separator. For those who may not just kind of be that familiar with that, and, you know, they see the contraption sitting on the frame, and they kind of get the idea that if I look at the bowl, I can tell, you know, my life and when it's time to to replace it. But let's go back to the tank and find out what's in that tank that you guys are concerned about from a fuel management standpoint. What are you really trying to control, and where is it coming from? Obviously, you told us about the contaminants, and those can come from anywhere. I mean, it can be raining outside, the wind can be blowing.
Correct.
Anytime we're moving fuel from one point to the next, then it's open to the atmosphere. And there's a lot of things in the atmosphere, depending on what part of the country you're in. So that certainly can happen. And you made a reference to ultra-low sulfur diesel. Why is that fuel more sensitive than the fuel that had all that sulfur in it?
Well, with ultra-low sulfur, they've taken the sulfur out, obviously. One of the things about that is it's going to hold more water. And holding more water is a huge problem because you have to separate that water. And then you add biodiesel. And, there's a lot, that's a whole subject in itself about biodiesel. And I'm not an expert in it. All I know is it holds more water, and we're separating that water from it. When it comes to the fuel tank itself, in the wintertime, and it's always interesting, when it comes to cold weather and we talk about fuel tanks, most of the issues that happen is that first really cold snap around the U.S., the fleets or the fuels aren't ready yet. And in the first couple of weeks is always where the biggest issue, I don't care what system it is, the fuels have to be somewhat prepped for that cold weather. But when it comes to the ultra-low sulfur, now, they had a lot of different additives into it because they took them out with the sulfur. And lubricants, obviously, is a big one because lubrication went out with the sulfur. And there's so many other variables. It's just there's standards, but you get anything and everything when it comes to diesel fuel. And there's stories that I don't even want to talk about on the phone that you hear on the radio that you find out in fuels that are out there. But the bottom line is to us is we just need to ensure that whatever's in that fuel tank will flow up to the fuel tank and out. And this goes back to we're not big on additives. We don't talk about it a lot, but treating the fuel in the cold weather to get it to the fuel pro itself. And that's generally not an issue in today because after the ultra-low sulfur come out, there's been a lot of changes. Everyone understands how it works. That first winter was really wild. There's some stories that guys would call me saying literally you take the clear cover off and it was a jelly bowl. It wouldn't move. It was those kind of things. You don't hear that much anymore. But when it comes to fuel tanks, we're there to whatever's in that tank to ensure, but before it gets that injection system, that we're going to take it out.
That's very important, and I've been fighting this battle since the fuel went from low sulfur diesel to ultra low sulfur diesel, and certainly, when you take the sulfur out of the diesel, then there's really nothing to fight the water, and so what happens is it's hygroscopic, and so it attracts moisture, and we find that black slime in there.
Yeah,
and
there you go.
And that's the ugly stuff, and that's it can be a couple things. Obviously, the black slime can be a living organism. For sure, from the water reacting with that fuel, for
Literally
sure.
algae in a lot of cases.
Yeah, just algae in there, or it can be hydrocarbons. It can be just fuel gelling itself. And, you talk about paraffins and, you think there are bees in there, but there's wax. And that wax got to stay at a particular point where it can be liquid and it continue to flow. And so you guys have your hands full managing what we're up against today. And every time there's a change in fuel, you guys have to consider it. But you guys do a good job. And so let's talk about the flow. Just for those who might not be familiar with, really, give me the flow of the fuel from the tank and then back to the tank again.
Certainly. So there's a couple different systems out there, but the basic system truly is from the fuel tank. And as Homer said on the frame rail, you have a fuel pro or a primary filter. In our case, a fuel pro. It has a fuel heater water separator filter. So then it goes on to a lift pump. And I'll go back to my analogy I used before. I use it many times in training. It's like a straw from the fuel tank. You're just sucking that fuel up. You're sucking it up. It comes through the fuel pro itself. It's going to drop the water out. It's going to separate the emulsified. And that's going to flow through our unit after it goes through the filter. And it's going to flow up to this lift pump. The lift pump itself, that changes to pressure. Now, on the pressure side, generally, especially after emission engines, there's a secondary filter. There was a time when there's only one filter in the system. It's going to have a secondary filter. It's going to push through. And then this goes back to what we talked about, and I think is where you're headed too, is the common rail and the pre-common rail engines when it comes to especially 2010 emissions. But the bottom line is, whichever system it is, from there it's going to go back to the tank. So you're literally going a full cycle and full circle in it. There is a however. There are a couple engines that it doesn't put much fuel back into the tank. It actually goes out of the return of the back of the head and goes back through the secondary filter and cycles through. There's a couple engines that have that. So you have very little fuel return to the tank. Now, that's important because if you think about it, on the high-flow engines, and high return temperatures going back to the tank on the common rail pre-2010 engines, you'd have a lot of warm fuel going to the tank, and there's still some of that away today. But a lot of them, it's low return common rail and it's low temperature. Now, what's the difference between a common rail and the unit injected? Well, it's basically what it says. Unit injected, previous to 2010 on most engines, literally the fuel is going per injector. With a common rail, it's literally flowing through. It's the same rail. The fuel's getting as it flows by, it's taking that fuel. That's a really basic way to put it. I'm not an expert, but what we know is if the temperatures now are not going to increase that fuel because they're not around the injector like they was in a unit injector. So now it's cooler fuel. And it goes back at a slower rate to the tank in a lot of cases. And again, they're not all the same. So just repeating myself, it's a full cycle is what's happening here. You're coming out of the fuel tank with a vacuum and a suction. It's going to pull it through. It's going to pull through the fuel pro. It's going to go into the lift pump. Now it's going to pressurize, and it's going to pressurize to a secondary filter. Generally, it's a little tighter micron. It goes through a couple different ways. It's the smaller engine injection pump, but mainly through the common rail or the unit injectors. And then most of the fuel is going to go back to the tank on most engines.
All right, wonderful. And when we get back, we'll get into the weeds a little more on this.